Hello, this is F. William Engdahl. I want to share with you an idea of a project that I'm planning to launch for a series of monthly audio seminars, subscription seminars on economics, politics, and basic geopolitics of our world. These would be also historical, so we better understand what the process is that's brought us to where we are today. And I want to ask you for feedback as to what price you would be willing to pay if you were inclined for such an audio seminar series. These would be monthly. And also how long you think they would be optimally. And I would ask you to give me some feedback in email form if you would, and look forward to hear from you. The following is the first demonstration of the kind of thing that I would be putting on my website. Thank you for your support. What I would like to do in this sample is talk for a few minutes so you get an idea of what I'm intending about how I see the world since 1945, since the end of the Second World War. And I want to go back to a project that was initiated in 1939. It was done in top secrecy. Today, some of the archives have been released by the Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank set up at the end of the First World War in London, in Versailles rather, by the bankers J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, their representatives there, as well as the leading circles of British strategic policy called the Round Table. And they created the New York Council on Foreign Relations to coordinate with the Chatham House in London, that they also created at the same time, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, to coordinate a grand strategy across the Atlantic that would more or less dominate the world. And in 1939, in the midst of the Great Depression, before the German Nazi panzers had rolled into Poland and formally began World War II, the New York Council on Foreign Relations was given a grant by the Rockefeller Foundation to do a project, top secret project, called War and Peace Studies. War and Peace Studies. And the project gathered together some of the top minds, political minds of America, and brought them in. It was, one of the leading figures was Professor Isaiah Bowman, then the president of Johns Hopkins University, and a geographer, interesting enough, in other words, geography of the world was his expertise. He even called himself, unfortunately, and he realized that, America's Haushofer, because Karl Haushofer was the architect or the ghostwriter, actually, in the 1920s of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf when he was in prison. And this group operated on the assumption that World War II was about to unfold, and they said, we have to plan now so that America is the survivor of that war and will replace all other contenders as the dominant power on the planet. So they literally brought in experts of every part of the globe, Central Asia, Asia, Burma, China, India, South America, Africa, of course, Middle East with the oil. And they worked out plans for dominating the key nations, the key geography spots, the Straits of Malacca with the Navy, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, all these choke points for oil flows or trade flows. And they created what was called a project called the United Nations Organization that became official at Dumbarton Oaks. And the idea was to create a geopolitical map of the world where the power of the United States military could dominate that world. And that more or less was what emerged from World War II. They waited, these strategists, and Roosevelt was informed of their plans. They waited until quite late into the war, 1942, sometime after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which Roosevelt also had foreknowledge of through cracking the Japanese codes, but let happen in order to mobilize the rage and fear of the American population for a war that was focused not initially against Japan, but against Nazi Germany and Europe. And after that war, the United States emerged. The Federal Reserve Bank had the largest reserves of monetary gold in the world, 70% by some estimates. They had much of the gold of the defeated powers, the Nazi gold and others. And American industry, because of the war mobilization, the aluminum industry, the aircraft industry, the vehicle industry of Detroit and so forth, the steel industry that was used to feed that, was the strongest in the world. It was American quality that was in demand everywhere. Europe was in an ash heap of rubble and bombed out cities. And Europe also had no credible currencies to rebuild, so they desperately needed to have dollars. And the Marshall Plan that was proposed and implemented in the end of the 40s, early 50s, was actually a way of giving taxpayer dollars to those European recovering governments so that they could buy American goods, buy American oil for their own recovery. So it was not an act of pure charity. It was a very calculated act to get dollars in circulation in Europe, and that allowed the dollar to dominate the reserves of the emerging post-war central banks of Europe, the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the Bank of Italy, and so forth, and ultimately the Bundesbank when that was allowed to be created. The process of American hegemony went flawlessly, one could almost say. It wasn't quite flawless. They made a coup d'etat in Iraq with the CIA and MI6 of Britain in the early 1950s against a nationalist who wanted to have a fair share of the revenues of British petroleum from the extraction of Iranian oil. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh nationalized the British Petroleum, Anglo-Persian Oil Company at that point, and offered to negotiate a purchase price of that, but said it was illegally taking the resources and raw materials of Iran, and that Iran deserved a fair price for its raw materials, for its oil. Well, the CIA branded Mossadegh as a communist. Everyone was branded as a communist who didn't sing with the sheet of music that Washington handed out. And the CIA made a coup d'etat against Mossadegh and installed the Shah of Iran, a monarchist, as their de facto puppet, with David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank being the bank of deposit for all Iranian oil revenues. Well, the state of affairs continued into I would say, the mid-60s, and then problems started emerging on the horizon, dark clouds. The U.S. decided to initiate a war in Vietnam. John Kennedy, the president, when that began as a CIA covert action to support the regime in South Vietnam against the communist North, Kennedy was assassinated, among other reasons, because he had planned to pull out of Vietnam, to not get involved in a land war in Asia. And among other things, he had fired Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, for the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba against Castro. And a group of disgruntled CIA former agents and their hired hands, got together with Lyndon B. Johnson, who was Kennedy's vice president, who had great hatred for the Kennedy brothers, Bobby and Jack Kennedy, although he was vice president of Jack Kennedy. And they plotted the assassination at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas in November 1963. And after the assassination of Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson did whatever the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military industry complex told them to do. They ramped up the war in Vietnam, and the defense industry was booming. But underneath that, the economy of America was beginning to rot out. The investment that made it the leading industrial nation after the end of the Second World War was becoming obsolescent, antiquated, out of date. At the same time, European countries, especially Germany and France, and a major part of Italy, were booming with state-of-the-art plant and equipment and beginning to export to the world and creating strong currencies and strong economies that were out-competing much of the American goods on the world market. The same was true for Japan. So at this point, the gold reserves of the Federal Reserve began to be redeemed under the gold exchange standard that was set up by Wall Street after the end of the war at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944. The gold was draining out from the vaults of the Federal Reserve and being redeemed by the central banks of Europe in exchange for the dollars. They were called gold certificates in those days, for the dollars that they had accumulated by exporting on the world market. And by August 1971, President Nixon was advised that the governments of France under Charles de Gaulle and the government of Germany, the Central Bank of Germany rather, were in the process of redeeming gold to the point where the reserves of the United States Federal Reserve were under threat of exhaustion, and something radical had to be done. At that point, on August 15, 1971, President Nixon held a press conference and told the world the United States was tearing up the Treaty of Bretton Woods unilaterally, without any negotiation with allies and co-signers, and putting the dollar on a floating basis with no gold backing, or no pegging to gold, rather. They claimed that they still had 8,000 tons of gold in the vaults of the Fed. That's an open question today, whether that's a truth of the matter or not, because they've refused to allow a Fed gold reserve audit since that time. And at that point, we had a floating dollar. The dollar plunged 40%. The Europeans didn't want to hold dollars. People said the dollar is highly inflated. To readjust according to the rules of Bretton Woods, the French government said the dollar would have to undergo a devaluation of 100%, and then there would be restabilization of the world monetary order. Well, the banks of Wall Street weren't about to let the U.S. Treasury or anybody else devalue the dollar by 100% against the German mark or the French franc or the Japanese yen or anybody. So they got together, David Rockefeller and his friends in the City of London. There was one or two Rothschilds in there. The major oil companies, which sold their oil on the world market for dollars, and that was the largest dollar commodity on the world market then as well as today, with the possible exception today of narcotics, heroin, and cocaine. And they got together in a closed-door meeting on an island outside of the city of Stockholm called Saltsjöbaden. 88 guests were handpicked and invited, all the heads of the major British American oil companies, David Rockefeller, Rothschild from the City of London, other bankers that were in the inner circles. They met under the aegis of something called the Bilderberg Group, which was set up by the U.S. and certain circles in Europe that are close to these U.S. circles,
to coordinate policy. And as I write in my book, A Century of War, and also document further in my second book, Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, what took place at the Saltsjöbaden meeting of the Bilderberg Group in May 1973 was a discussion of the world oil market and OPEC, a discussion where the attendees were told that the world was on the brink of a dramatic increase of OPEC oil price, and he gave some numbers which worked out to pretty much on the dot 400% increase. And the discussion of the Bilderberg Group was not how can we convince the Arab oil sheikhs, the King of Saudi Arabia, the Shah of Iran, and others, not to do such a dramatic price increase because that would cause a world recession. Instead, they talked about what do we do with the petrodollars? How do we recycle, as Henry Kissinger put it? He was invited to that Bilderberg meeting, by the way, as Secretary of State under Nixon, who was fighting Watergate at the time. And they discussed how do we make sure we recycle the huge increase of dollar flows for oil sales on the world market into the vaults of Chase Manhattan Bank, David Rockefeller's bank, Citigroup, the banks like Barclays and Lloyd's Bank in the City of London, Rothschild banks. And we control where those petrodollars go in the world. And that's precisely what happened in October of 1973 through the shuttle diplomacy of Henry Kissinger. The Yom Kippur War, as it was called, Israel against Egypt and the Arab OPEC countries, took place, and true to what he threatened to do, the King of Saudi Arabia embargoed oil flows from OPEC to Rotterdam in Europe and to the United States. There were gasoline lines everywhere in the United States back then. I remember vividly having to stand for quite a long time just to get a tank of gasoline. And that was part of the strategy. The oil shock was a planned strategy to recapitalize the banks of Wall Street, the major banks, and to make the dollar strong again. The dollar shot up through the roof during the rest of the 1970s. There was a second oil shock when the Shah of Iran fell and Khomeini came in 1979 in Iran. And those two oil shocks created a colossal inflation in the world, the great inflation that Paul Volcker was called down from New York, where he was a vice president of David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. He was called down to become chairman or governor of the Federal Reserve by President Carter. And Paul Volcker claimed that inflation had to be squeezed out of the system. Well, the inflation was caused by the oil shock, but no economist, no government official linked the two together. So to squeeze inflation out of the system, Paul Volcker raised interest rates by 300% in 1979 in a period of some 6 months. And what he squeezed was life out of the American economy. The U.S. went into a deep recession, but not only the U.S., the economies of Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and so forth, who had borrowed these petrodollars from the City of London from Eurodollar banks at floating interest rates. And when they borrowed the money back in the 70s, the interest rates were floating at a very low level, and they said, oh, well, this is a good deal. Suddenly, in a period of 6 months, the debt service on their loans, their dollar loans to those banks, exploded by 300%, and those loans became unpayable. That was the beginning of the Latin American debt crisis, all of it pre-planned. Nations of Latin America were forced by the International Monetary Fund, which was nothing but the hard cop for the Wall Street and London banks. They were forced to take national responsibility for the debts of their oil companies and other private concerns that had borrowed the money, borrowed the dollars at low interest rates. And that became public debt, and the governments of Argentina, Brazil, and so forth were forced to undergo IMF conditionalities to repay that public debt. And the conditionalities were always the same as they are today in Ukraine and other, well, Ukraine is an exception, but in Africa and other countries. The IMF would tell the government, you have to let your currency devalue dramatically so your exports can come onto the world market to pay your debt. Then you have to cut the public budget, and if you have subsidies for food for your poor population, or if you have budgets for education or health services, that has to be slashed. You're spending beyond your means, and you can't borrow anymore unless you do this shock therapy. And you have to privatize your state-owned assets, your oil companies, your copper mines, your gold mines, whatever. And at that point, with a cheapened currency, the dollar could buy anything and did buy anything. People like George Soros became the largest landowner in Argentina back in those days because it was literally dirt cheap. And that was the next step in the looting process that kept the banks of Wall Street and City of London on life support, artificial life support. It's known as looting. Well, that kept them above water until the end of the 1980s, and at that point, they were in serious liquidity problems. The major banks of Wall Street, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, they were all, in 1989, de facto bankrupt, insolvent. There was an emergency meeting at the White House. Bob Dole was involved in that meeting. He was a potential presidential candidate. And I came into possession of a facsimile summary from a contact of mine on Wall Street of what was discussed at that meeting. And it was the dire state of the largest banks in America and how to recapitalize them. And at that point, something very interesting happened. Poland and the communist government of Poland collapsed, and a trade union-based organization called Solidarność, supported by the Reagan administration, supported by the National Endowment for Democracy and by the CIA, as well as Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope, elected a non-communist government. The first domino in the Warsaw Pact Soviet Union system collapsed. And it wasn't long, the end November of 1989, before the Berlin Wall fell down. And George Soros and Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard University, with Larry Summers coordinating the show under the Clinton administration as Deputy Treasury Secretary, began the looting of Poland with shock therapy, as Jeffrey Sachs called it, the looting of Poland, Eastern Europe, the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, but above all, the looting of the crown jewel of the whole thing, what now was the Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin was brought in with the help of a group of corrupted KGB generals that had contact with the Western CIA services, and literally became billionaires in return for selling out their country. And they developed a group of young entrepreneurs mostly in their early 20s. The oldest was 42, his name Boris Berezovsky, and linked them up with Western banks, Riggs Bank of Washington, D.C., which was well known since the 1950s as a CIA bank. Riggs Bank set up a branch in Geneva for money laundering called Riggs Valmet, and the Russian oligarchs that were being created by these KGB generals would literally steal the assets under the Yeltsin regime Yeltsin was their man. He was told his family could become fabulously wealthy if they played the game, which he did. And the oil and gas resources of Russia, the Russian Federation now, were looted in a fraudulent privatization. Inflation went up to 2,500% at one point. The ruble was completely worthless. That was part of the strategy, so that dollars could buy any and every asset that was worth buying. And George Soros and his friends, Ronald Lauder and others, came in and began plundering the Russian economy. The money was laundered through Switzerland, through the Isle of Man, and through other offshore centers, and the Bank of New York. And this was the real origin of the so-called Russian organized crime. It was called the Russian Mafia. It was indeed a mafia, but it was these KGB generals that had sold out their country. 300 senior KGB officers involved in the plot fled Russia and were given U.S. Residency status outside of Washington and Virginia, and permanent, very, very cushy pensions. It was a small price to pay for the billions that they had helped to loot. And the looting of Eastern Europe and the Russian Federation during the 90s kept the Wall Street game afloat for another decade. But that now begins to falter. The financial crisis that emerged in 2007, 2008 in Wall Street has not been solved 8 years on. The interest rate level that the Federal Reserve is able to manage or maintain is 0.25% for Fed funds, interest rate for the bank reserves. And that is the strongest indication that the banking system is on artificial life support. It's known as zero interest rates. The economy of the United States today is in tatters. The infrastructure has a deficit. Donald Trump addressed this in his latest remarks on acceptance of his election victory. The infrastructure has been estimated, the bridges, highways, electric grid, water supply, and so forth, in deficit more than $3 trillion. Nobody during the Obama years made any serious attempt to address this deficit, nor did they, of course, in the George W. Bush years. And the infrastructure collapse of America is one of the most heavy weights on a functioning economy that we have. Were that to be addressed, jobs would be created, the living standard would rise, the tax revenue of the federal government would increase, real estate prices would stabilize on real levels, not just because Chinese millionaires are taking their money out of China and buying prime real estate again. And the money would not be spent on waste for wars everywhere. The military budget is pure waste. It doesn't do much more than create the jobs of the people who produce the stuff, but most of that is produced overseas anyway today. So this system, which I would call a debt slavery system, was called the American Century by the group of people who created it around the New York Council on Foreign Relations, and it was named that by Henry Luce, the publisher of Time Life magazine at the time, in an essay he wrote in Life magazine in 1941. And he more or less triumphantly proclaimed the American century to replace the British century. Well, it didn't last a century. It lasted maybe 7 decades. And now the foundations of that American century, based on the debt model, the debt slavery model of the Wall Street banks, is predictably in a collapse phase. The question is whether the next president, Donald Trump, after the 20th of January 2017, will be deliberately left to blame for the economic collapse that is inevitable, when the Fed, under his presidency, will finally begin raising interest rates and collapsing the artificial stock market bubble that's been built up by zero interest rate Fed policies over the last 8 years. And then regroup and reorganize to continue their wars for globalization, conquest, everything. I think the world right now is at a fascinating crossroads. We have the potential to build a literally new century, a Eurasian century, with high-speed rail linking from China to Russia to Belarus all the way to the port cities of Germany and Holland, and bring development of entire new markets, trillion-dollar markets, onto the world economy, and do that peacefully. If that's allowed to happen, Europe can undergo the potential of an economic revival. Right now, Europe is being choked to death by a faulty structure called the euro and the European Central Bank. And if that were to be dissolved or fall apart of its own dead weight, Europe has a chance to be a partner with this, what the Chinese call One Belt, One Road, or sometimes the new economic Silk Road, and create an economic renaissance that the world has not seen in modern history. With this, I want to close out today and ask you to please give me a short email with feedback on what you think of the idea of monthly podcasts of this nature, and and tell me what you would be willing to pay to become a subscriber, either on a test basis monthly or on an annual basis for a lower rate. Thank you very much for your listening.